Thank you for inviting me, and thanks so much for the very kind introduction. And I'm sorry that I do not speak any Portuguese. In Embodied Selves and Divided Minds, I appeal to insights from enactivism and embodied cognition to examine the notions of subjectivity and selfhood. As articulated by theorists such as Weber and Varela and Thompson, enactivism asks us to trade in a Cartesian view of mind in favor of a more Aristotelian approach that emphasizes the biological character of mentality. According to this view, there is a close connection between being alive and being cognitive. To be alive is to be capable of cognitive engagements. One striking aspect of living systems is that their patterns of interaction with the environment have much to do with their own viability constraints. A living system always has to make sense of the world and supplement itself with what it lacks in order to remain viable. What Varela and Maturana call cognition and what Thompson has referred to as sense-making is meaning generation that takes place from the concerned perspective of a living organism, and is the process whereby it interprets environmental stimuli in terms of their vital significance. The living organism helps to determine what counts as useful information on the basis of its structure, needs, and the way that it is structurally coupled with its surroundings. It does not passively receive and process stimuli from an external world, but rather creates and maintains its own domain of meaningfulness through its effort to maintain and preserve its identity. Of course, gauging meaning and significance in a complex social world such as ours goes well beyond mere survival and self-maintenance, and has much to do with adapting and faring well in a specific sociocultural context. Among human animals with sophisticated nervous systems, objects of desire and need that are placed at a distance in space and time are conceptualized as goals, the achievement of which require coordinated movement. And pursuit of one's goals often leads to the formation of built-up patterns of engagement and response. Over time, these characteristic patterns of movement and behavior become more ingrained and come to comprise an individual's habitual mode of engagement and sense-making. Learning and socialization no doubt play a huge role, and habits of mind are formed via interaction with others, cultural norms, and other people. As Dewey rightly notes, habits are socially acquired responses formed under the influence of other people, which we come to amass over the course of a lifetime. By virtue of being causally embedded in a social environment, we form habits of mind in accordance with the demands of that environment. Once habits form and become more ingrained, there is a sense in which social norms are internalized and sedimented in the body. Our living bodies thereby become socially saturated and socio-normatively laden. Cognition and affectivity, therefore, are best understood as socially embedded, environmentally influenced, and heavily modulated by relationships and norms. Importantly, the influence of the social environment can be beneficial or detrimental. Existing social norms and dynamics can either, 1, cultivate adaptive habits of mind that promote human flourishing, or 2, contribute to maladaptive habits of mind that alienate people from deep-rooted human needs and interfere with overall well-being. One of the expanded zones of contemporary life in which habits of mind are profoundly modulated so that the cognitive, affective, and behavioral dispositions of an individual fall squarely in line with prevailing social norms is the college or university setting. When they do their job best, higher education offers students the opportunity not only to learn new skills, but also to develop the capacity to think and act critically about each and every aspect of their world. Universities have the potential to cultivate certain interpersonal habits, such as cooperation and active listening, and a particular kind of affective stance, one which centers on perspective-taking, empathy, openness, curiosity, and imagination. However, inside higher educational institutions guided by neoliberal ideology, individuals are habituated to toxic interaction patterns and modes of evaluation that are the norm for that domain. Rather than cultivating critical thinking and promoting self-realization, these institutions often undermine such capacities. College and university settings in contemporary neoliberal democracies such as the United States thereby give us a powerful example of how social institutions sometimes serve to cultivate habits of mind, behavior, and modes of valuation that impede human flourishing. Enactivism, sense-making, and effective framing. Enactivism centers on notions of autopoiesis and autonomy and holds that mindedness is rooted in structural dynamics associated with metabolism, self-regulation, self-maintenance, and adaptation. In simplest terms, autopoiesis is the process whereby the constituent processes of living systems produce the components necessary for the continuation of those processes. Thompson's work explores how autopoiesis serves as the basis for the conscious minds of living organisms and describes how living beings as autonomous agents that actively generate and maintain their own coherent patterns of activity. Basic autonomy is the capacity of a system to manage its own flow of matter and energy so that it can regulate and control both its own internal self-constructive processes as well as its processes of exchange with the environment. Central to this enactivist view is the notion of sense-making and the idea that cognition is a process of ongoing active engagement between a living organism and its surroundings. It's the organism itself, given the nature of its receptors, bodily organs, which determine what stimuli in the environment it will be sensitive and responsive to. Physical and chemical phenomena in and of themselves therefore have no particular significance, but only take on meaning to the extent that they relate positively or negatively to the norm of the maintenance of the organism's integrity. By defining itself and distinguishing between self and world, the organism creates a perspective which changes the world from a neutral place to an umwelt that always means something in relation to the organism. Colombatti has examined how sense-making is bound up thoroughly with affectivity, emphasizing that a living organism always makes sense of things from the standpoint of its own concerned perspective, in light of its adaptive interests. It is the precariousness of metabolic processes, in particular, which is crucial to the development of a concerned point of view. In order to monitor and metabolically regulate themselves with respect to their viability conditions, living systems must be able to discern what is suitable for their continuation. The ability to make sense of things involves the capacity to be personally affected, to be touched in a meaningful way by what is affecting one. Note that one need not be in a specific mood or emotional state to be in an affective state. Instead, there is a more basic mode of activity, which Colombatti calls primordial activity, that is rooted at some basic level in the appropriate activity of metabolism. An entity that is interested in surviving and concerned about getting the material resources it needs for its own continuation projects this concern onto its surroundings. While many inactivist theorists seem open to the idea that low-level organisms such as bacteria are capable of subjectivity, I argue that while life is necessary for mind, it is not sufficient. This is because I have doubts as to whether this minimal mode of sense-making is accompanied by subjectivity or anything closely resembling concerned point of view found among humans or other mammals. Instead, subjectivity emerges out of living biological dynamics in the sense that it is an enrichment of those dynamics. Such enrichment does not mean that something gets added from the outside in order to generate subjectivity. Instead, life evolves in such a way as to transform sense-making, such that subjectivity as well as more complex forms of cognition arise. What is required for this evolution, in my view, are the capacity for sensory motor coordination and the development of what I call effective framing patterns. One way to describe an effective frame is as an effective mode of presentation, whereby significant events or states of affairs are disclosed through diffuse, holistic bodily feelings. Affect operates as the allure of consciousness and implies a dynamic gestalt or figure ground structure, whereby some objects emerge into effective prominence while others become unnoticeable. While the prefrontal lobe no doubt plays a crucial role, effective framing also engages metabolic systems, endocrine responses, musculoskeletal changes, and cardiovascular responses. Thus, the notion of effective framing emphasizes that subjects enact meaning and personal significance in and through their feeling bodies, and therefore thereby draws attention to the effective, essentially embodied nature of sense-making. The cognitive emotional interpretations that constitute effective framing are physically grounded in organismic processes of self-regulation aimed at sustaining and enhancing adaptive autonomy in the face of perturbing environmental events. Effective framing selectively attunes the organism to the environment and allows it to appraise the relevance of particular factors in light of its own particular needs, body size, ways of moving, and current context. This is crucial for survival insofar it is a means of focusing attention that allows living organisms to deal with the complexity of the surrounding world. According to the enactivist view, the identity of an autonomous system is somehow self-generated and lies in its dynamic organization. This identity can be understood as a pattern which, given the adequate initial and boundary conditions, recursively contributes to its own maintenance. However, discussions of autonomous organization should not be limited to basic biological organization or metabolic self-maintenance. After all, as noted earlier, human engagement takes on an especially sophisticated form, and adaptivity goes well beyond mere survival and self-maintenance. A human subject also strives to fare well within a particular sociocultural context and must navigate through the surrounding social world. Adaptive regulation of environmental engagement, therefore, is not simply subordinated to viability constraints, but also is governed by the need to maintain neurodynamic and behavior organization. This can be understood in terms of the self-maintenance of coherent behavior patterns. Among creatures like us with sophisticated nervous systems that are capable of internally mediated proprioception and coordinated movement, there develop enduring affective framings and patterns of bodily attunement. A subject's habitual way of framing objects and events comes to be embodied in characteristic facial expressions, gestures, postures, movements, and overall bodily comportment. The pursuit of goals requires complex movement sequences and often leads to the formation of recurring modes of engagement and response. Orderly form and structure appear where previously absent, and lived bodily dynamics come to exhibit certain characteristic patterns. Along these lines, DiPaolo describes a kind of self-sustaining, self-generating dynamic form in animal behavior and in neural and bodily activity that is reflected in characteristic patterns of bodily expressivity and response, perceptual invariance, and organized action. Likewise, Froese and DiPaolo hold that cognition involves the adaptive preservation of a dynamical network of autonomous sensorimotor structures sustained by continuous interaction with the environment. One paradigmatic example of these autonomous structures are habits, which encompass parts of the nervous system, physiological and structural systems of the body, and patterns of behavior. Similarly, Sheets-Johnston describes how, over the course of learning how to move our bodies, we forged a large number of dynamic patterns that became habitual. For example, brushing one's teeth, tying a knot, and writing one's name all were woven into our bodies as familiar dynamics, and came to bear the stamp of our own qualitatively felt movement patterns, our own familiar synergies of meaningful movement. Such movement patterns comprise habitual dynamics of emotional response, including facial expression, gesture, posture, and vocalization. The top-down constraints of habits of mind are selectionist and reduce the number of ways in which component aspects of our lived bodily dynamics can operate. It's not simply neuron firings that entrain and form integrated patterns, but live bodily dynamics as a whole. This includes the operation of integrated neural somatic systems, sensory-motor processes, hormones, the circulatory system, and the respiratory system. Brain and body are interdependent and mutually regulating, and as the animal interacts with the environment, a global pattern of distributed, coherent bodily activity comes to govern its sense-making activities. Over time, various elements of the musculoskeletal system become entrained, and the whole human body behaves as a pattern-forming, self-organized system governed by non-linear dynamical laws. But in my view, habits include not only characteristic patterns of movement, but also characteristic ways of attending to and interpreting the surrounding world. Such patterns constitute a subject's particular bodily affective style or temperament, and the form or structure of comportment whereby she shapes her environment into a meaningful domain. These habits of mind become more ingrained over time and help to determine how the individual engages with and makes sense of the surrounding world. In creatures that are sufficiently neurobiologically complex, these affective framings and highly integrated behavior patterns become quite extensive and sophisticated, giving rise to a characteristically human form of life. The life-shaping thesis. It is important to acknowledge that the development of habits depends upon both external and internal constraints. Biology, developmental factors, and environmental influence all play a role in shaping a living animal's neurobiological patterns, interpretive tendencies, and characteristic bodily responses. Learning, no doubt, plays a huge role, and over time, a living creature becomes selectively attuned to certain aspects of its surroundings and develops specific behavioral tendencies. This ability to learn from prior experience and to establish patterns of attention and response that have proved effective in the past helps living animals to adapt and fare well. Among humans, in particular, habitual modes of engagement and response are formed, modulated, and transformed as an individual interacts with her social environment and modifies her behavior in accordance with norms, expectations, and cultural values. More needs to be said, then, about the way in which our habits of mind are not just fully embodied, but also socially embedded. My proposed life-shaping thesis says that insofar as we are essentially social-minded animals, the affective framings that comprise our human form of life are all partially determined or shaped by our social surroundings. By a partial determination or shaping of our embodied minds by something X, I mean that X affects us and thereby has an influence on us as minded animals in a salient, significant way that is at once causal, itself partially determined or shaped by means of self-reflexive feedback loops, and irreducibly normative. First, what is causal influence? I hold that X has a causal influence on Y just in case A, X has some sort of necessary efficacious role to play in the production of some mental or physical properties or facts about X, about Y. B, there is some sort of general, distinctively law-like connection governing the production of Y properties or Y facts by X. And C, had X not existed, then those Y properties or Y facts would not have existed. Thus, to suppose that social interactions and forces have a causal influence on mindedness is to suppose that these social factors have a necessary, efficacious role to play in the production of a subject's desires, beliefs, emotions, etc., and that without the contribution of these social factors, these various dimensions of mindedness would not have existed. So far, this account of partial determination or shaping is quite similar to Rupert's hypothesis of embedded cognition, which says that cognitive processes depend very heavily, in hitherto unexpected ways, on organismically external props and devices, and on the structure of the external environment in which cognition takes place. Similarly, according to Strelny's scaffolded mind hypothesis, many animals intervene in their environment, shaping it in ways that improve the adaptive fit between the agent and the world. However, while both Rupert and Strelny focus exclusively on cognition, there is good reason to think that environmental resources also support and amplify human affectivity. What Colombetti and Kruger call affective niches are instances of organism-environment couplings that enable the realization of specific affective states. Individuals are drawn into certain modes of interaction, often by way of attunement and habituation to interaction patterns, modes of evaluation, and feeling patterns that are customary for that domain. What Slaby calls relational affect is not primarily a matter of the affective experience of individual persons, but rather an interactive dynamic that inheres in social domains of practices. Other people often have a strong influence on us, and it seems clear that engaged, active collectives are capable of exerting a forceful, effective pull on individuals that shapes their affective framings and interpretive habits. In addition, neither Rupert nor Strelny examines the irreducibly normative aspect of the causal contribution made by the environment. In a basic biological sense, norms are linked to vital requirements such as biological self-maintenance. The living organism regulates its coupling with the environment according to norms established by its own viability conditions. Normativity arises from the self-production and self-maintenance of a precarious system, and through its ongoing individuation, the system intrinsically determines which interactions support its continued existence and which threaten its survival. Thus, at a basic biological level, what is good or bad for a living organism is determined by its own internal organization. However, the origin of social norms does not lie fully within the individual. Instead, these norms are acquired in other self-sustained psychological or cultural modes of life. This is to say that adaptive agency in a complex social world such as ours goes well beyond mere survival and self-maintenance, concerns faring well in a particular sociocultural context. Social norms provide a framework within which we form values, attitudes, and desires, think thoughts, execute intentions, and social institutions enhance specific patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior by providing a normative framework that rewards, reinforces, or discourages certain kinds of stances and behaviors. The concrete, material, and discursive arrangements of a social domain, which include its physical layout, explicit rules, and informal forms of conduct, exert formative pressure on individuals to habituate in line with the dynamic patterns prevalent in that domain. Some interactions are good for the socially situated subject, and some are bad. Some regulations and modes of coupling with the socio-cultural world are adequate and adaptive insofar as they enable the individual to fare well in that social environment, and some are maladaptive insofar as they involve heavy penalties, sanctions, or social disapproval. Social norms thereby modulate sense-making and mold subjects' overall bodily comportment. The influence of social factors should not be understood exclusively in cognitivist terms. Particular social institutions often involve a web of shared norms and practices and a particular affective atmosphere that incentivizes participants to feel, think, and behave in certain ways rather than others. Individuals are drawn into certain modes of interaction, often by way of affective attunement and habituation to interaction patterns and modes of evaluation that are the norm for that domain. The norms that shape the participants' feelings and patterns of evaluation are not principles chosen by the individuals, but rather the various operating logics are normative principles that are prevalent in and partially constitute the social institution in question. While some institutions foster highly dialogical collaborative activities, empathy, and cooperation, others encourage hypercompetitiveness or toxic group interaction. By virtue of participating in a social institution, subjects come to be bound together in a certain kind of social interaction that is characterized by specific norms and a particular affective atmosphere, so that the social environment serves as the organizing plane on which the cognitive and affective lives of the individuals unfold. Still, although the origin of social norms does not lie fully within the individual, there is a sense in which the individual internalizes them. I argue that the notion of habit helps to make sense of the idea that social influences and norms can become sedimented in the body. Since our bodily habits are dependent on social norms, and since we make sense of the world in and through our living bodies, norms thereby bring about life shaping. Via the development of integrated patterns of behavior and attention, the living body becomes normatively laden by social expectations and mores. Higgins points to gender as an example. Due to expectations and norms regarding the enactment of feminine and masculine identity, individuals routinely adopt gendered mannerisms and habitually come to regard and experience their bodies in particular ways. Building on these ideas, I maintain that internalizing norms of masculinity and femininity centrally involves the adoption of specific habits of interpretation, movement, expressivity, and response. There are characteristic modes of speaking, walking, gesturing, dressing, and interacting with others associated with femininity and masculinity, and boys and girls begin to develop these habits from an early age. Habits develop in part because social institutions encourage the adoption of certain patterns of behavior, certain patterns of bodily and affective engagement while discouraging and sanctioning others. In the case of gender, there are serious penalties associated with displaying habits that run counter to socially prescribed gender norms. Another example is the way in which workplaces enhance particular affective tendencies and inclinations by providing a normative framework that rewards certain kinds of stances and behaviors. People sanction or encourage particular kinds of actions, shape others' behavior, and thereby reinforce the kinds of practices that they endorse. In response to these social pressures, subjects may develop what Berman and DiPaolo call sensory motor strategies or schemes. These schemes can be understood as organizations of several sensory motor coordinations, which typically are deployed against the backdrop of some normative framework, for example, considerations of efficiency. Importantly, the relationship between habits of mind and normative practices is reciprocal. I hold that something X is partially determined or shaped by means of self-reflexive feedback loops, just in case X's characteristic properties and facts are partially determined or shaped reciprocally by our own active and reactive contributions and responses to X. A minded subject is not only shaped by the social world, but also helps to shape the social environment through her active and reactive contributions and responses. Individual behavior and patterns of attention thus are both anchored in and contribute to these shared normative practices. When people accept prevailing norms and sanction or encourage particular kinds of behavior, they can thereby reinforce those practices and norms. Individuals begin to comport themselves jointly in ways that are conducive to the smooth operation of the social domain in question. And through the broad participation of many different individuals, meaning is enacted collectively and in line with the functioning principles and values of that particular social institution. It is important to note, however, that although subjects do often act so as to reinforce particular social practices and norms, they also have the capacity to defy and undermine them in a range of different ways and to varying degrees. Sometimes the contribution made by a particular agent or group of agents may result in a modification of the social world, so that norms that were once dominant begin to fade away and new sociocultural practices, norms, and values begin to take their place. Although individuals do often get locked into particular modes of movement and engagement, effective framings, as effective framings become more ingrained, these patterns are not fixed or static, but rather loosely assembled and susceptible to ongoing change. This means there is always some potential for people to shift their effective framings and develop new habits of attention, thought, feeling, and bodily response. Much of the philosophical work that addresses the contribution of the social world describes how our cognitive affective lives are scaffolded and supported by social institutions and relations. For example, Gallagher and Chrysofi describe how our cognitive systems are enmeshed with and enabled by mental institutions, such as legal systems and scientific practice. In the case of legal systems, jurists, judges, and lawyers rely on principles, precedents, and procedures as a set of tools that can help them to resolve disputes. As a result, they do not have to think through cases alone, but rather can build upon others' previous cognitive work. Similarly, the scientific community's practice of sharing and comparing theories and hypotheses provides scientists with cognitive resources and tools to build upon and modify scientific research. According to contemporary sociologists, political scientists, and cognitive scientists, collective intelligence is an emergent property that is constituted by the cognitive capacities and activities of a group of people, especially including group reasoning, group brainstorming, and innovation, the social production of written texts and other kinds of social media, group deliberation, and participatory decision-making. When there is a relatively high level of social group coordination, creativity, problem-solving, and productivity, people often are able to achieve things they could not achieve on their own and display what might be termed collective wisdom. However, precisely because social institutions have the potential to scaffold, support, and positively contribute to cognitive and affective processes, they also have the potential to distort these processes and thereby detract from our well-being. While enabling social structures work towards setting up mental patterns that are in the long run empowering and conducive to individual and collective flourishing, deforming social structures create unhealthy dependencies, tie us to oppressive routines, sustain inequality, destroy communal bonds, or lead to mental habits that are detrimental to us or our kin. The notion that one can form bad habits by spending time with the wrong people is a prime example. Moreover, sometimes habits and effective framings that are adaptive in the short term, insofar as they help the subject to cope with her surroundings, for example, smoking as a way to alleviate stress, or adopting a competitive stance as a way to get in the workplace, prove to be maladaptive and harmful in the long term. And some social institutions systematically shape our lives in such a way as to alienate us or even undermine our mental health. They do so by cultivating habits of mind and behavior that prevent people from satisfying their deep-seated human needs and impede human flourishing. However, if these harmful affective framing patterns become more ingrained, the continuation of these patterns can become goals in themselves, and it becomes increasingly difficult for individuals to modify their bad habits. Indeed, some social institutions mentally enslave people in the sense that they cultivate habits that are detrimental to people's fundamental well-being and yet incredibly difficult to resist. In part, this is because people are rewarded for adopting these habits and punished for rejecting them. Moreover, these habits of attention, valuation, and response shape people's sense of what is relevant and important to such a great extent that it becomes difficult even to question them or imagine things otherwise. Of course, habituation and the modulation of effective framings is the result of influence from a variety of social institutions and continues over the course of a lifetime. We learn who we are largely through interactions with others, and all of society's institutions are part of this self-creation process. But some social institutions seek out individuals in order to turn them into bona fide exponents of the domain's operative processes and encourage them to conform to the routines and demands of that domain. Such institutions cultivate framing patterns and habits of mind that exert a strong pull on the subjects involved and implicate them in the workings of the institution, even if that runs counter to their avowed interests or is in other ways detrimental to their well-being or flourishing. In these cases, affect functions as a shrewd mechanism for keeping subjects attached to oppressive or otherwise pathological conditions. To illustrate how engaged active collectives are capable of exerting a forceful, effective pull on individuals in ways that run counter to their interests and give rise to unhealthy forms of life, I look to the example of higher education in the United States. I will suggest that the habits of mind, behavior, and modes of evaluation that are cultivated by the neoliberal university are detrimental to learning, undermine human flourishing, and serve as a powerful example of what Slaby calls mind invasion. Among those who participate in such institutions, affect is profoundly and irresistibly molded, often in ways contrary to how individuals would feel, act, and comport themselves if they were not bound by the norms of those institutions. To understand what I mean by a neoliberal university, it is important to highlight some of the operating logics and normative principles that have come to govern the workings of such institutions. The concept of neoliberalism is a many-membered set of concepts, and when that set of concepts is applied in the real world, its effective policies and practices operate at local, state, and global levels. While these facts can make it difficult to define neoliberal ideology, there are some broad beliefs and commitments that unite these various ideas, practices, and policies. First, neoliberalism is a return to an extension of laissez-faire capitalist economic theory. Its central tenets are that the free market is benevolent, that state intervention and regulation of the economy should be minimal, and that the individual should be understood as a rational economic actor. On this view, the market is inherently efficient, and competition naturally leads to economic growth and prosperity that will necessarily benefit all individuals. Any equality that arises will be due to hard work and natural abilities. Any intrusions into the market should be avoided, given that they restrict proper market operations and prevent individuals from freely engaging with the market. Second, the market comes to be viewed as the governing mechanism that should encompass every aspect of society. This emphasis on economic rationality therefore applies not only in the marketplace, but also in the social sphere. As a result, in a neoliberal world, there is no longer a distinction between the market and the state, between the public and the private, and between the individual and the social. Individuals increasingly see everything they do in terms of maximizing their human capital. This sort of free market fundamentalism emphasizes winning at all costs, ruthless competitiveness, hedonism, and individualism. Within the context of higher education, some of the trends that reflect a neoliberal stance include decreased support for programs of study that are not business-oriented, reduced support for research that does not increase profits, the replacement of shared forms of governments with business management models, the ongoing exploitation of faculty labor, and the use of student purchasing power as the vital measure of a student's identity and worth. One could argue that higher education has always intentionally or unintentionally served capitalism, and to an important extent. Nevertheless, what is new to the neoliberal university is the scope and extent of these profit-driven corporate ends, as well as how many students, faculty, administrators, and policymakers explicitly support and embrace these capitalist goals and priorities. They do so, for example, when they talk about the education market, return on investment, and value for the money. However, this explicit embrace of neoliberal attitudes almost always takes place without people ever mentioning the term neoliberalism. Administrators, faculty, and students rarely state that they are neoliberals or that they believe in neoliberal ideology. How then can this ideology be so influential? In fact, it is precisely because people do not typically notice the impact of neoliberal ideology that it is able to exert such a strong influence. Neoliberalism has modulated our habits of mind to such a great extent that it defines our common sense beliefs and becomes indivisible from our basic ideas and fundamental assumptions. These effective framing patterns become especially influential guiding frames that are long-lasting and deeply entrenched, and which influence many of our more momentary framings and temporary patterns of attention. Some patterns of effective cognitive engagement properly align with a particular range of activities, interactions, and expressions that are expected or permissible in the context of the neoliberal university, while others do not. Those that do align are effectively rewarded or encouraged, while those that do not are effectively discouraged. What results is the cultivation of a particular sort of bodily affective style and particular effective framings that are structured and sanctioned by that social institution. This occurs in part by way of emotional contagion, various synchronic mimetic responses on a basic affective bodily level, and explicit demands and sanctioning on the part of the established domain members. People who become immersed in the neoliberal university will reinforce a market-oriented, cognitive affective orientation by way of mimicry, gesture, and affective bodily styles that signal approval or disapproval, encourage or discourage, reward with warm connection, or punish with subtle hostility. Newcomers will be habituated in accordance with the effective patterns present within the institution. Note that it is not that certain kinds of affect simply accompany or color our habituated human experience inside the neoliberal university. On the contrary, we can rightly speak of a far-reaching mental infrastructure, one which involves complex patterns of affect and affective relations that shape and structure people's affective tendencies and modes of relating to others. In particular, neoliberalism encourages people to experience themselves as isolated agents, motivated at all times by instrumental rationality, and to regard everything as a competition. It encourages them to focus on the economic dimension of human life while downplaying other social and relational values such as empathy, cooperation, and collaboration, and to view all of their pursuits merely as a way to increase their human capital and advance their economic ends. The pervasiveness and normalization of capitalist economic logic and the expansion of exclusively instrumental rationality into cultural, political, and social spheres helps to create the appearance that this is the natural approach to the world, that this is simply the way things are. This is because neoliberal ideology has infiltrated our institutions, discourse, and common sense. It has engulfed people's framing tendencies and thereby permeated every aspect of life. This culminates in saturation of our consciousness, so that the educational, economic, and social world we see and interact with, and the common sense interpretations we put on it, become the only world. The fundamental assumption of neoliberalism thereby are embedded into our consciousness by way of ingrained affective framings and yield habitual patterns of thinking, valuing, and behaving. Now turn to a discussion of how neoliberal ideology has come to govern colleges and universities in the United States, and how the resulting commodification and mechanization of higher education contribute to false consciousness and widespread unhappiness. Neoliberalism urges us to view all social institutions as markets in which we make myriad choices, investments, and cost-benefit calculations. The subject enmeshed in a neoliberal university comes to frame and organize everything in her social life as a material good to be bought and sold, even if this perverts the true value of the object in question and distorts its sense of meaning for the individual. People come to conceive of higher education as the faculty production of credit points and the student consumption thereof, usually in the form of standardized units called courses or modules. As education comes to be viewed in relation to market norms and values, students begin to view themselves as consumers, and colleges and universities emphasize value for the money. The primary goal of education is to get a job, and higher education increasingly is focused on return on investment in monetary terms in the form of higher future income stream. A student deciding whether to go to a given university will weigh the rankings of the university on one or more measures. For example, the success of graduates in obtaining suitable employment. Majors, courses of study, and faculty research all are judged primarily in terms of their ability to contribute to the market and private interests. Faculty come to view themselves as providers of a saleable commodity, such as a diploma, a set of workplace skills, or some other credentials. Professors also come to be viewed by outsiders as sellers of that good. If faculty do not sufficiently market their courses and students fail to show up in sufficient numbers, then the faculty are held responsible for that failure and judged accordingly by their administrators. As education comes to be understood as a service provider-customer relationship, universities become obsessed with rankings, product differentiation, and innovation. There's pervasive talk of competitor schools, the market in higher education, and the need to engage in advertising and marketing campaign to promote the brand. Administrators overtly pretend to be concerned with the quality and intrinsic value of instruction. However, their primary focus typically is on how much money professors bring into the university, whether via externally funded research grants or via increasing enrollments. Also commodified are research results, discoveries, and creations. Increasingly, we describe users as consuming information, and we treat knowledge as a form of capital. While academics traditionally have spoken of contributions to the literature that anybody can access and share, intellectual property rights treat information and knowledge as a form of private ownership. This, in turn, significantly inhibits research creativity and progress. Fruits of research are no longer integral parts of a general quest for knowledge, but instead become units of intellectual property. Publicly funded research increasingly is privatized and sold for profit on the open market. Due to this commodification of knowledge and information, there are fewer opportunities for collaborative research and less value placed on communities of scholars. This undermines scholarly research as a public good and as part of the intellectual commons. In addition, research becomes more and more dominated by economic ends. Instead of asking whether it furthers our understanding of the world or promotes some public good, it is increasingly guided by corporate and commercial interests and the goals of industry. Ideas and research products come to be validated and valued for their success in attracting outside funding while developing stronger ties to corporate powers. Knowledge production also is seen as a means to promotion and tenure, and thus part of the pursuit of wage labor and promotion. And the value of information and knowledge as a public good for intellectual and social progress is now secondary to its primary rationale for economic enhancement, both for the individual researcher as well as the institution. As universities become increasingly dominated by market mechanisms, organic social processes are transformed into codified rote processes. In the context of neoliberalism, things begin to be framed in quantifiable terms and evaluated in terms of input-output efficiency and the maximization of profit. Due to this increased focus on efficiency, systems of shared governance become overshadowed by more hierarchical, business-oriented models. Decision-making processes that allegedly focus on collaboration and the generation of knowledge are transformed into decision-making structures that emphasize competitiveness and efficiency. In the past, administrators tended to be academics, but more and more universities now hire administrators with managerial backgrounds whose focus is on efficiency and making the institutions more competitive. This is because the redefinition of educational issues as economic issues removes the need for those knowledgeable in education to be meaningful members of the decision-making process. In addition, the shift toward markets and competition has pushed administrators to govern universities as much as possible by numbers. Curricula, teachers, and information are transformed into what amounts to machine parts. Terms such as efficiency and sustainability come to govern academic program development, course scheduling, and the restructuring of academic departments. Purely instrumental economic metrics are used to evaluate academic departments, universities, and faculty members. For example, a department's performance is measured by the number of graduates, number of students taught, and academic outputs, such as publications or citations, patents, or grants secured by the department. Information about a university's efficiency in the use of state funds, the graduation rate of students, the time required to complete a degree, and the salaries of recent graduates often is used to determine its ranking. These metrics of performance and efficiency may be translated into a financial reward or sanction for academic departments or institutions. Neoliberalism also asks us to assume that within all organizations, including colleges and universities, there are individuals who either do the bare minimum to receive a paycheck or engage in activities that are largely unrelated to the goals of the university. Since all individuals invest their human capital only as necessary and simply wish to maximize their own personal gain and not those of the employer, this creates a moral hazard. The solution to this problem is increased management and surveillance in the form of audits, departmental program reviews, performance metrics, and self-evaluation mechanisms. In order to enhance accountability, efficiency, and transparency, administrators are urged to collect massive amounts of data on the productivity of university faculty. Rhetoric that emphasizes accountability requires faculty to provide verifiable documentation of their productivity via norms and metrics established by their managers. Because they must provide all too frequent verification of their efforts, faculty members eventually and ultimately lose their capacity to determine their own behavioral norms and make decisions about how best to utilize their time. Instead, faculty must devote a growing proportion of their time to administrative tasks and fill out a seemingly endless barrage of forms about virtually every aspect of their work. Such forms encourage those who are audited to think about and enact their work in certain ways, to note how their activities conform or not to certain norms implicit in the forms. The information that faculty supply then is used by administrators to grant or deny tenure and promotion, grant or reject merit pay, and make what are usually called market adjustments in the salaries of individual faculty. Those who conform are rewarded, while those who work against the grain or resist being audited are sanctioned or sacked. The upshot is that colleges and universities increasingly are governed by free market rhetoric together with intensive coercive managerial control practices. it appears that the illusory solution to the fiscal crisis in higher education is to monitor, regulate, and reduce the costs of intellectual production. But to do so requires an ever larger and more coercive administrative apparatus. Associated trends include higher numbers of administrators, structural reorganization, the constant threat of spending cuts, more emphasis on marketing and business generation, move towards performance-related pay, and the ranking of citations. Shared governance between faculty and administrators diminishes, and there are few attempts to affirm faculty as scholars who have autonomy and power. Often there are great costs associated with framing things differently or acting contrary to what the university demands. Any criticism of core practices is interpreted as a lack of loyalty to the institution and therefore viewed as fundamentally subverted. Critical intellectuals are in very real danger of being denied tenure or otherwise fired, publicly shamed, or blacklisted. At the same time, there are salient rewards associated with compliance and conformity. In the context of the neoliberal university, subjects experience a transformation of their ordinary set of desires, including both instrumental as well as non-instrumental desires, into a rigid, static set of wholly instrumental desires whose structure mirrors the externally imposed, wholly instrumental goals of the institution. What was once a loosely assembled dynamic framework of effective framings is replaced by a rigid set of values and norms cultivated by the social institution. Identities, desires, and modes of subjectivity are shaped in accordance with market values, needs, and relations. Students learn that their fate is solely a matter of individual responsibility and are taught to embrace self-promotion and hyper-competitiveness. The importance of social bonds and collective reasoning begins to erode, and there is little or no room for compassion, empathy, or non-egoistic ethical considerations. While students are naturally curious and want to learn new things, neoliberal values pervert this natural love of learning. Students are encouraged to view their university education as a mere means to get a job. Similarly, faculty who once valued research for its own sake as intrinsically valuable begin to view it solely as a mere means to job security, promotion, and professional status. Performance-related pay replaces their intrinsic satisfaction and desire to contribute to their field with a system of externally driven rewards and a perceived need to compete. As a result, subjects who participate in neoliberal institutions of higher education gradually come to believe, falsely, that the externally imposed, rigid, static set of incentivized desires actually are their own, and also begin to have an illusory consciousness of agential sorthood when they are in fact being externally manipulated by those desires. In other words, they begin to buy into this new set of effective framings that have been cultivated by their college or university, and it becomes utterly normalized. It's just the way things are. The subject's own habits of mind and attention become part of the problem. Within educational settings, this sort of mind hacking is especially problematic, given that the very subjects whose critical thinking skills are needed to question, critique, and challenge what is happening are themselves the targets and ultimately the products of these formative influences. As a result, the space for insiders' self-critical assessment of higher education shrinks dramatically, and may even disappear altogether. The university itself, rather than defending the importance of educating an engaged citizenry, is in danger of becoming an ideological bulwark for corporate interests. This is because, as an influential social institution, the university helps to reproduce the notions of common sense, the basic values, ideas, and relations necessary to sustain the market. Among professors, there is a tendency to accept and embrace the view that the university is first and foremost a place to prepare students to be competitive in the marketplace. Many faculty also have come to believe that metrics and quantifiable modes of evaluation truly reflect the quality of research, and that the main purpose of education is employment, that fields that don't explicitly prepare students for specific jobs are less valuable. They unblinkingly speak of the market and their competitor schools, and unreflectively view students as consumers whose satisfaction must be promoted at all times. Because they are beholden to corporate interest, career building, and the insular discourses that accompany specialized scholarship, many professors become entirely comfortable with the corporatization of the university and the new regimes of neoliberal governance. Among students, there is a serious danger that neoliberal ideology creates a kind of social amnesia that erases critical thought, historical analysis, and any understanding of broader systemic relations. Focused on maximizing their human capital and a cost-benefit approach to their education, students begin to lose their very capacity to imagine a different and more critical mode of subjectivity or envision the world otherwise. Insofar as neoliberalism's best trick is to convince people to remain attached to a set of ideologies, values, modes of government, and policies that generate massive suffering and hardship, it makes it difficult for subjects to challenge ingrained effective framings that are detrimental to their overall well-being. Rather than promoting collaborative dialogue and critical thinking, the workings of the neoliberal university often deform people's thinking and feeling so that they view knowledge and education in exclusively narrow, reductive, purely instrumental terms. As people come to frame things in the way the neoliberal university explicitly or implicitly demands, they are cut off from some of their more basic, deep-rooted human needs and may begin to hate what they used to love. Aristotle maintained that all rational human animals desire to know. However, under the influence of neoliberalism, many students are cut off from their natural love of learning and their inborn desire to understand themselves and the world. Students who see their education as a private and very expensive public good and who view their coursework merely as a means to get a decent paying job may grow dissatisfied with the learning process. As rational economic actors, students alter their goals from what were largely intrinsic, such as developing a meaningful philosophy of life, to largely extrinsic goals, including being very well off financially. This results in a loss of intellectual curiosity and diminished enthusiasm for learning. Meanwhile, faculty experience growing cynicism of what they perceive to be ridiculous chores of audit. Dealing with the new performance measures itself becomes a kind of performance, and skillfully performing the dance of satisfying performance measures becomes a fruitful, lucrative strategy in a setting in which only appearances matter. The introduction of permanent coercive control over faculty also introduces a culture of permanent mistrust and an atmosphere of zero-sum competition. Those who survive in the system eventually become alienated from their deep-seated desires for social connection, cooperation, and collaboration. And as more and more tasks are viewed simply as a means to achieving some economic end, professors' intrinsic motivations to gain wisdom and knowledge are increasingly replaced by extrinsic rewards. As a result, there is increasing demoralization, loss of motivation, and decreased job satisfaction. In summary, the influence of neoliberal ideology and the commodification of higher education systematically cultivates and sustains habits of mind that undermine human flourishing. The example of higher education within the United States thereby helps to illustrate how prevailing ideology sometimes shapes people's patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior in detrimental ways.